That's the great thing about science, which you can call atheism if you wish, is you're willing to change your beliefs. You're not assuming the answers before you ask the question. You're not assuming you know what's divinely right just because you interpret a certain book to mean a certain thing, and someone else may interpret it to mean something else. You will agree there are different interpretations of every book, including the Bible and the Quran. And so to presume that you know divine truth before you've asked the universe is not sensible.
This question of meaning is an interesting question. And if science tells us that there's no objective meaning to the universe, no purpose or meaning, does that make our lives purposeless and meaningless? Absolutely not. Quite the contrary. It means the purpose and meaning in our lives is what we make. It makes what we do more important. It makes the compassion we show others more important. We're not being told what to do by some cosmic Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, in many religions doesn't just condemn you to torture for while you're alive, but for all eternity. You do it because we derive meaning and, in fact, the recognition, not from religion that all humans have equal dignity, but from science, that we're all a common species. In fact, that there's nothing sacred, that we create compassion and action, and in fact, that humans are no different than other animals in the sense of being evolved species. And we have to realize that we share the earth with them, and in fact, those ideas allow us to address what are the real problems of the 21st century.
Science has taught us that the world we think exists is not necessarily the way the world is. And we cannot have a consistent sense of reality without being willing to force our beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality rather than the other way around. When we look out at societies that deny that we think are backwards, and I'll pick one as fundamentalist Islam, we look at people who have denied the reality of the world around them. They have turned their backs on science, and we view them as uncivilized, and they've turned their backs on science, and part of the reason that the problems is because by turning their backs on science, they've departed from the modern world and don't have the benefits of modern technology. If we're going to have a consistent understanding of how we're supposed to behave, we have to understand that the world is different than our intuition necessarily projects, and science has been the only way to learn about that.
Of course religion is outdated in the 21st century. Most religious people, to respond, it's true that you may get many people saying they're religious, but none of them, in the first world at least, in the developed world, to first approximation, actually believe the doctrines of their faith. They like to be religious. They want to believe, to use something from the X-Files. They want to believe in believing. So that Catholics don't really believe that when a priest holds a wafer, it turns into the body of Christ. No one really believes that nonsense. I have, in the last week, spent more time talking to Jewish atheists than I can count. Most of the Jews I know are atheists, and they say it's perfectly reasonable to be Jewish atheists because there's other aspects of the Jewish religion they like. So the point is that the doctrines of religion are outdated, and that's for good reason. They were created by Bronze Age or Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the earth orbited the sun. So the wisdom in those books is not wisdom at all. And people take the wisdom. In fact, we've actually learned something over the last 20 centuries, and science has taught us how the world works. Now, for science, the interesting thing as a scientist is that God is completely irrelevant to science. Most scientists don't spend enough time thinking about God to even know if they're atheists, because they try and understand how the world works, and God never enters into it. It's just completely irrelevant. And in fact, the more we've learned about the natural world, the more we've learned that you don't need any divine intervention to explain anything. As far as morality is concerned, and the person you want to be, which is really what I think is the heart of what religion, when religion provides many things for people, and we can't deny that. The question is, how can we take the things that people need, community, support, hope, and use the real world to build those quantities? Because religion, if you base your beliefs and your actions on myths that are incorrect, you're inevitably going to take irrational actions. And so what we want to do is what science does, which is force people's beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality rather than the other way around, and not assume the answers to questions before we even ask them, and use the rational world to build a global society, not an exclusionary society, but a global world where people can live together based on the reality that we're all humans sharing this planet, and we need to work together to build a better place. a morality based on rationality and not outmoded religious beliefs.
That doesn't mean I respect ideas. Okay, some ideas are ridiculous. And that's perfectly reasonable. In fact, ridiculing ideas is what makes progress. So if I offend some of you, I don't mean to offend you personally. I may offend some of your ideas, but that doesn't bother me at all. In fact, if you confront my ideas, it will lead to a discussion. What does offend me, of course, is offending personal freedom and equal rights, and that's one of the reasons why I got upset at the beginning of this session. But that's been fixed, and I thank the organizers for that as well. To agreeing to not segregate this room in a 21st century is a great step forward, and I appreciate that. Now, you know, I'm really shocked. First of all I've watched Mr. Sorsis, right? Sorsis. My Greek is pretty good, I think.
Be gorgeous.
Yeah, gorgeous. Well, you are rather gorgeous. Gorgeous George over here. I watched some of these, and they're always exactly the same. So I thought they'd be different this time. And it always begins with you, and I'm supposed to respond to you. And I will, to some extent, but it's hard to respond to nonsense. And in fact, the point of this is not a question, does God exist? That's not the question. It's atheism or Islam or atheism, which is more sensible, I think is what it says, or something like that. Now, I was just shocked because I thought that you wouldn't bother to try and pretend you knew science, because you don't, and we're going to go through that in real detail. Everything you said is nonsense when it comes to science, so we'll go through and we'll have a little chat if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, good. And so I found it remarkable that you began with that kind of nonsense, and we'll continue from that. But let me just first begin with the fact that the premise of this debate is in some sense inappropriate, because it suggests two things. First of all, it suggests that Islam is something special, and it isn't. It's not special at all. It's one of 1,000 religions or more that have existed since the dawn of humanity, all of which claim divine revelation, all of which claim perfection, all of which proclaim infinite knowledge, uniqueness, beauty, etc. So Islam is just a religion like any other religion. And there's no difference. It proclaims, just as the Rig Veda did and Akhenaten in ancient Egypt, that the universe had a beginning, nothing special, okay? There's absolutely nothing special. So the question is, Islam as one of 1,000 religions, all of which make the same claims, but mutually inconsistent ones. So one of the things we know is, of these 1,000 religions, they all make mutually inconsistent claims, so they can't all be correct. In fact, at best, one of them can be correct, because they're not consistent with each other. So that means a priori, just a priori, and I know like that, you like that term instead of a posteriori. I've heard you say that. A priori, Islam has a probability of 0.1% of being correct, because it's just one of 1,000 religions, and one of them is at most is correct. But since they all make the same claims, it's probable that none of them are correct. So treating Islam specially is inappropriate. Then atheism is somehow, as has been described, speaker, a belief system. It's not a belief system like Islam or Judaism or Christianity or the Norse myths or Zeus or Thor or any of the other myths that have been created throughout human history. All it's saying is, it's not a belief system. It's saying, you know what? We don't choose to believe that stuff because it's not sensible. So it's not saying we believe X. It's saying, well, this myth is inconsistent with this myth, or this myth is inconsistent with what we know about the universe, and therefore, it's unlikely to be true. So what atheism is just saying, this is unlikely to be true. It's not a belief system. So to compare one versus the other is, of course, false. It's a false premise.
Well, a famous biologist once said every scientist is an atheist when they go in the laboratory. They don't think anyone is twiddling the knobs. They accept the fact that the evidence of the experiment will tell them what's going on. They don't think that someone's controlling it. So I don't define myself as an atheist. I should first say that. I define myself as an anti-theist. Namely, it would be presumptuous of me to say there's no purpose to the universe, because I can't prove that. I can't prove there's no God. I can't say definitively there's no God. And if science tells us that there's no objective meaning to the universe, no purpose or meaning, does that make our lives purposeless and meaningless? Absolutely not. Quite the contrary. It means the purpose and meaning in our lives is what we make. It makes what we do more important. It makes the compassion we show others more important. We're not being told what to do by some cosmic Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, in many religions doesn't just condemn you to torture for while you're alive, but for all eternity. You do it because we derive meaning and, in fact, the recognition, not from religion that all humans have equal dignity, but from science, that we're all a common species. In fact, that there's nothing sacred, that we create compassion and action, and in fact that humans are no different than other animals in the sense of being evolved species. And we have to realize that we share the earth with them, and in fact those ideas allow us to address what are the real problems of the 21st century. And if we keep going back to this medieval or earlier kind of myths, we won't address that. In fact, I sort of take umbrage at the sister's remarks, because I don't think anything she said had anything to do with religion. She said understanding dignity, treating people with compassion, and then what people of religion do is they usurp that. They say, if you're not religious, you can't have any of that. But all of those ideas come from a rational view of who we are and how we should relate to others. The best example of tolerance and across cultures that I can think of is nearby here in Geneva at the Large Hadron Collider. There is a machine that's built by people from 100 different countries, speaking a dozen different languages with many different religions and cultures, building these devices that have to work to a millionth of a meter. And it works because science brings people together. Science tells us that we are a common species and we can work together to make the world a better place. And I will close with a quote. I won't sing it, you'll be pleased to know. From Jacob Bronowski, who said, the world is permeated through and through by science. And you can't turn it into a game merely by picking sides. Like it or not, the world is governed by science, the physical world. And if we want to deal with our real problems, we have to accept what nature is telling us instead of imposing our beliefs on nature.
So arguing that something doesn't make sense to you is based on the fact that the assumption that you know what's sensible in advance. But we don't know what's sensible in advance until we explore the world around us. Our common sense derived from the fact that we evolved on the savannah in Africa to avoid lions, not to understand quantum mechanics, for example. As I've often said, common sense, our deductions might suggest that you cannot be in two places at once. That is crazy. But of course, an electron not only can be, but it is. It doesn't make sense because we didn't evolve to know about it. We've learned about it. We force our idea of common sense to change. It's called learning. Some people would rather read an ancient book than learn. And this has been a very good evidence of that. For example, to say something is inconceivable just means you can't conceive it. But the great thing about the universe, and the reason that I do science, is that the universe has a much greater imagination than we do. In fact, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And that's what's wonderful about the universe. Things that are inconceivable happen all the time. And what that does is that expands our mind. And expanding our minds to conform to the evidence of reality is common sense. The more important thing is that Francis is a good friend of mine. Sure. We've become friends the last day or so talking. And so reasonable people can act reasonably. But nevertheless, the question, so there are different levels. Obviously, you won't deny your children education, okay? Because you're not that extreme. But there are people who do, and that's certainly child abuse. But even more so, you point out that you're a Christian because, in large part, because you grew up to be a Christian. I grew up in a Jewish family. It's hard to overcome those things when you're a child. And I think Richard Dawkins gives a very good example that really raised my awareness. It was a beautiful picture in a newspaper at Christmas time of three kids in the newspaper. And it's just a heartwarming picture. These three little kids, and they're playing together, and it says it's a Muslim kid and a Christian kid and a Jewish kid, and you go, ah. And then you think, what if I said it's a neoliberal kid, a libertarian kid, and a conservative kid? When they're 3 years old, they're none of those things.
We label kids by a religion which is, as you point out, is a complex, deep issue. And we force it upon them to label them, saying you're a Christian child and you should believe these things before they have any concept of death, life, suffering, all of the things that lead adults to either forsake their faith or keep it. And isn't it unfair to force that upon a little kid?
Here's an idea of why common sense should tell you that Islam, like many other religions, is not common sense. Because, of course, homosexuality is perfectly natural. In all animal species, almost, it's natural. It occurs with a 10% frequency. Okay? In fact, there are good evolutionary reasons for homosexuality. So in that sense, there's no reason and a fundamental... Why would a God who thought it was a sin make it natural among all species? I don't think the sheep, by the way, which 10% of sheep are long-term homosexual relationships. Okay? Why would a God who thought it was a sin create sheep who aren't able to think about it be homosexual? That's the kind of nonsense that we have to ask, and the only way we can determine if it's nonsense is by looking at the world around us, not by deducing it, not by listening to the words of ignorant individuals and Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. Wisdom and learning comes from observing the world around us, and we shouldn't take our wisdom from people who didn't even understand the way the world worked. My intent, and I'm sure I've offended people here, my intent was not to offend. I always offend, and I offend some of my scientific colleagues too. My intent was just to raise questions and encourage people to think about issues. And for that, I hope that some of the statements I've made will cause people to think. And indeed, my whole point is that given access to information, and I believe you should get access to information about the world really works, which is why I write scientific books and I speak, because I think these are some of those beautiful ideas people have ever come up with. That we shouldn't be afraid of them, we shouldn't fear them, we shouldn't view them as if, in fact, if they offend our beliefs, that's a good thing, because it means our beliefs are wrong. And that, as I say to students all the time, is the greatest gift we can have. Changing our minds and learning is what's produced the progress that allows this room to happen, that allows these video cameras to be recording things. So I just hope that as I hope I am willing to change my beliefs or change my mind in the presence of evidence and get information, that I hope that some of the things I've said has spurred your thinking, and I certainly don't want to convert you into anything. And so thank you for listening. We have seen people's morality, if you want to call it morality, change. Slavery might have been okay because you might have believed that certain groups were inferior or not human. Science has told us that's wrong. You might have believed, as almost all religions do, that women are chattel. Science has told us that's wrong. You might have believed that homosexuality is evil. But science has told us that all mammalian species have homosexuality. There's nothing unnatural or evil about it. So to have a morality without science is empty. But the Islamic God, much like the Judeo-Christian God, is a real creep. This is a God worse than Saddam Hussein. Instead of torturing you just for your life, tortures you for infinity. Forgive me the word, but eternity. Let me use that word. Eternity for not believing. For not believing, you're tortured for infinity. The tortures are actually described in the Quran, and you know it as well as I do. And the point is, if you just ask yourself common sense, if you were a divine being, say you had an ant colony that you made in your house, would you be offended if those ants didn't pay homage to you well, let's start with 50 times a day before Muhammad cut it down to 30 and then 5. Would you be offended if those ants didn't pay homage to you 5 times a day? And if they didn't look up to you or didn't recognize your existence, would you destroy them? No, I mean, it just seems so petty. So why should we believe in a hateful, unmerciful, petty, sadomasochistic, homophobic, sexist God? It's just irrational. It's not sensible. You have this guy. Yeah, you do. Temporarily. Yeah, well, 9.5 years, ladies and gentlemen, 9.5 years you put up with him. And he is, as you know, silent scientist, government scientist talking about things like climate change, because he comes from Alberta. And whenever we allow that, whenever we allow that kind of censorship, that kind of open restrictions on questioning and pointing out inconvenient truths, then we have a problem. There's a connection between, in free societies, being afraid to offend people for ridiculous religious ideas, and the right of people in other authoritarian societies to kill people because of them. It's a slippery slope. When we accept nonsense with any sort of impunity in our society, we do it a disservice to ourselves and, most importantly, to our children. If science has done anything, it's to liberate humanity from the shackles of superstition and enforced ignorance. It's happening in the end. It's not militant to celebrate this openly, to combat a conspiracy of silence and acquiescence, to make questioning everything so normal and so accepted that young people will not feel guilty for doing that, that TV hosts will not have news stories when someone does it, will not accept governments, totalitarian, theocratic or democratic, that endorse, encourage, or enforce or otherwise legitimize the suppression of free thought. We owe it to our children, not just here but around the world. We owe it to the media to point out that self-censorship destroys a free press, the basis of a modern democracy. We owe it to all people around the world. And scientists have an obligation to be a part of that. Now here's an idea of why common sense should tell you that Islam, like many other religions, is not common sense. Because, of course, homosexuality is perfectly natural. In all animal species, almost, it's natural. It occurs with a 10% frequency. Okay? In fact, there are good evolutionary reasons for homosexuality. So in that sense, there's no reason and a fundamental... Why would a God who thought it was a sin make it natural among all species? I don't think the sheep, by the way, which 10% of sheep are long-term homosexual relationships. Okay? Why would a God who thought it was a sin create sheep who don't have a soul, who aren't able to think about it, be homosexual? That's the kind of nonsense that we have to ask, and the only way we can determine if it's nonsense is by looking at the world around us, not by deducing it, not by listening to the words of ignorant individuals and Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. Wisdom and learning comes from observing the world around us, and we shouldn't take our wisdom from people who didn't even understand the way the world worked. Thank you. If you spank the vacuum hard enough, you'll actually kick out real particles. And those particles are called Higgs particles. So for 50 years we said, we want to build a machine that will spank empty space hard enough, where we take enough energy from and put it in a small enough region that maybe we can excite real particles, and if that Higgs field really exists, then those particles should exist. And as you know, on July 4th, 2012, we discovered the Higgs particles. We discovered we live in this world that's an illusion. That the only reason you and I exist are because of it. Because once the Higgs field gets mass, it turns out, once the particles that convey the weak force get mass, so do many of the particles that make you and I up. We think much of the mass of all elementary particles is due to interacting with that Bose condensate that exists throughout all of empty space. If it wasn't there, all the particles that make us up would be massless. Our existence is an accident. We are like those that live on that icicle. The world that we live in which we exist in, the world that some people claim was created for us, is just an accident and an illusion. In the underlying reality, all the particles that make us up are massless, the particles that convey the weak force are massless, and it's all there just because the universe happened to freeze in a certain random direction and cause that Higgs field to form, just like in certain materials, and only certain materials, if they get cold enough, it'll freeze and form a Bose-Einstein condensate. And those other materials are not superconducting. If the universe hadn't frozen randomly in that specific direction, just like that icicle, we wouldn't be here. So much for a universe created for us. It's just an accident, like living on an icicle. And just like those people who live on an icicle, if they did, would create a theology explaining why it was so beautiful and purposeful that the universe was created so that they could exist, they wouldn't know that in another icicle, somewhere else, the other direction would be pointing, and would be specially favored, and their universe would be very different. It's a cosmic accident. I'm in Canada, I had to show beer bottles, but if it's just like what would happen. Our universe, it turns out, is just like
We think what happens if you have a party, a beer party, which all Canadians have and will have later maybe. But if you're like me, you forget to put the beer bottles in the fridge before the party. So what you do is you put them in the freezer. And then you forget. And then the next day you open one up and it cracks. Because under high pressure, the liquid is a liquid. But the minute you remove the pressure, the preferred ground state, the beer suddenly freezes, the water and liquid expands, breaks the bottle. And that's what we think happened in our universe. In fact, it describes very well the history of the early universe, which led to the existence of the Higgs particle and the Higgs field. It's just like a beer party. Our universe is just like a beer party where you left the bottles in. If we can probe the physics of inflation, one of the predictions of that physics is that, in fact, most of space is still expanding very fast. Our universe was like a seed that decoupled from that background space that was expanding, but there should be many other universes, some of which are just being born now. If we can test the physics of inflation, we'll turn this metaphysics into physics, because we'll be able to probe the theory, and even though we won't ever be able to see those other universes, we'll be able to make predictions about our universe based on that theory, and if they predict the 50 things we can measure accurately, then the 51st, which we can't see, which is the existence of other universes, is something that we'll be willing to at least indirectly accept. Just like when Einstein was developing, in fact, his special theory of relativity, we didn't know, no one would ever thought we'd be able to see atoms. But everyone knew atoms existed because of all the indirect evidence. So I come here not to bury God, but to praise honesty, full disclosure, and skeptical empirical inquiry, which, alas, are burying God. But that's the key thing I want to talk about. And so since I believe in full disclosure, I thought I'd give some full disclosure, which is my biases. What really matters to me is the ethics of science, open questioning, the fact that there are no scientific authorities, that we believe in honesty, transparency, reliance on evidence, peer review, and testability. All of these, I believe, make the world a better place. And they do so specifically by burying myth and superstition and dogma. This is what a gravitational wave looks like. This is what it does to space. Experimentalists have built another detector to detect gravitational waves. This is the largest detector around Earth to look for gravitational waves. This is in Hanford, Washington. There's another one in Louisiana that looks the same. And it is amazing. In order to detect the kind of gravitational waves they're looking for, they had to design a detector that could measure a change in the length of that tunnel, 4 kilometers long, compared to the length of this tunnel, that was 1/100th the size of a proton. And they could do it. They built the detector to do that, but they still haven't seen any gravitational waves. Human civilization began by putting purpose and intelligent purpose behind gods associated with the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans. It's been, by one estimate, over 1,000 different gods throughout human history. Mars, god of war, Poseidon, Thor, all the rest. And the really important thing is that all of you, or almost all of you probably, are now atheists regarding those gods. Just the only difference is it's just one that we may disagree about. But 999, we all agree, have been thrown out. And the reason they've been thrown out is they've been buried by the rise of our physical understanding. Science works. And the fact that science works has buried the gods of the wind and the sun and the moon. Farmers now, as I was just saying, when it doesn't rain, they don't pray for rain anymore. They go see a meteorologist. And that's a good thing. In the process, the human condition has improved immensely, and it will continue to improve as science continues to bury the one remaining God. Now, this one God is supposedly left. We might ask a priori or in advance, how likely is in advance that all those other 999 gods were false, but this one's true? Well, you might argue, if you had a flat prior, that it's probably pretty small likelihood. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that our current understanding of nature has changed. We've learned things. It's changed and developed since the claims were made by Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. And therefore, it's natural that science is inconsistent with those claims based on ignorance. And we shouldn't revere those ancient claims as sacred. They're ignorant. There's still many open questions. I'll try my 10 seconds of humility. It'll be the only time tonight. There's a lot we don't know about the universe, a lot more we don't know than we do. That's the wonder of science. That's why I'm a scientist. But it is intellectually lazy to just stop asking questions and stop looking for physical explanations and just say God did it. When we look out almost 13.8 billion light years away in all directions, we see radiation coming at us from that surface, because at that moment, when it cooled to below 3,000 degrees, matter became neutral, the universe became transparent, and this image, called the cosmic microwave background radiation, has actually won 2 different Nobel Prizes for the discovery. The discovery of it, and this image is really a baby picture of the universe. If you want to see the non-projected version, it's like this, with us at the center. We're not at the center of the universe, because if we moved over here, we'd see a sphere centered around us over there, and if we were over here, we'd see a sphere centered around us over there.
When you think about it, you're looking out at the center of this. This is a picture taken from Earth, and looking out this way, we see about 13.8 billion years back in time. Looking out this way, we see 13.8 billion years in time. So it's not surprising that that's 13.8 billion years away there, that one's 13.8 billion years away there. So there just hasn't been time in the universe for information to go from point A to point B. But as Lawrence said, if we step a little bit to the side, we see a slightly different sphere. That means that there's stuff outside of this sphere that exists that we can't see. And indeed, with our current understanding, we will never be able to see this, because the universe is accelerating, and the light from material out here will try to get to us, but the universe expands faster than it can make it through the creation of space. And so we have a real fundamental question. If I can't actually ever see or know this stuff exists, and it seems like it should exist, is it really there?
And when it comes to the origin of the universe, we are coming remarkably close to the realization that you don't need any miracle for that either. And that's because our knowledge of the universe is changing, not because we want to get rid of God, but because the more we learn, the less we need anything outside of the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. But it's good, because science does more than that. It just doesn't just tell us about the world, it makes the world a better place. It gets rid of the vile, awful, immoral works like the Bible. The worldview that I would argue guides most of you in this room today, including those of you people of faith, which I assume is some fraction of the people in this audience. Those spiritual values of any educated person today are largely the worldview given us by science. Your worldview is vastly different than it would have been 4 centuries ago. By stripping ecclesiastical authority of its credibility on factual matters, which we've certainly done, we cast doubt on its claims to certainty in matters of morality, which is great, because we now think that women are equal to men, that we don't hate gays, all of the stupid myths that are permeated by various religions. The facts of science, moreover, force us to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves, our species, and our planet. And that is what we need to do in the 21st century.
As Carl Sagan said, if we're alone, it's an awful waste of space. But at some point, the question comes down to an interesting question of how rare is intelligence? I mean, it could be, and I happen to believe that since all the conditions for life exist elsewhere in the galaxy, water, organic materials, light, all of that, that life is ubiquitous. But I'm willing to believe that even if it's really rare, there's still a lot of intelligent life in the galaxy.
Where are the aliens?
Okay. Well, we live in a random corner in the far edge of the Milky Way galaxy. Fermi's paradox is that, well, look, if life evolved, it would basically colonize the galaxy, and you could calculate it would send out robots or parts of its civilization to 4 other planets that would then send to 4 other planets. And everything would grow exponentially. It's not a bad logic, but I don't think it's inevitable. It's just as plausible to me that civilizations will exist where they are until they exhaust all the resources where they are, and then they'll move on. At the same time, as Fermi's paradox is certainly not illogical, but not necessary. Even if life is very rare, in an absolute sense, it can nevertheless be very abundant. It may sound ridiculous, but that's possible in the universe. I mean, it's a long shot that even if there's life out there, we'll ever know about it. That's the sad thing. But I also, at the same time, believe it's out there, and that's good enough for me.
I would say morality is impossible without science. That's the point. Because, and religion is an example, as I say, I can't think of a more immoral document than the Old Testament. But The point is, if you don't know the consequences of your actions, then you can't even decide what's right and wrong. And so and so we have seen people's morality, if you want to call it morality, change. Slavery might have been okay because you might have believed that certain groups were inferior or not human. Science has told us that's wrong. You might have believed, as almost all religions do, that women are chattel. Science has told us that's wrong. You might have believed that homosexuality is evil. But science has told us that all mammalian species have homosexuality. There's nothing unnatural or evil about it. So to have a morality without science is empty.
When we look out at the sky, the cosmic microwave background, the afterglow of the Big Bang, one of the most important observations in cosmology, and won another Nobel Prize last year, in fact. We've already learned that there may be problems because we've seen some anomalies in that radiation bath, in the way the temperature changes from point to point. Does that point out some new physics? Maybe, maybe not. The reason being that we now think we can understand how all of the galaxies we see in the universe today arose as quantum fluctuations in the early universe, random quantum fluctuations. Well, if they're random and if they're probabilistic, then every now and then you can have something that seems weird. If I flip a coin, every now and then I'll get 12 heads in a row. Right. Well, if I flip it a lot of times, I won't see that too often. But if I only flip it 12 times and I happen to get 12 heads in a row, I don't know if the coin is fixed or if it's just an accident. And when we look at some of the fluctuations now that are a little weird, we don't know, because we only have access to one universe, if it's fundamentally weird physics or just an accident of the universe in which we live, which is really kind of a fascinating problem.
And the point is that my science is a human cultural activity. And in fact, if you read my writing, you'll see that I say the worth of science, in my opinion, is not from the technology. We tend to love its technology, which has made the world a happier, healthier place for most people. But it's the fact that, like art and music and literature, it forces us to reassess our place in the cosmos. It opens our eyes to the world. And art and music and literature do that, but so does science. And there's no sense in which science reduces the value of art, music, and literature. And in fact, the most famous example I know of in that regard is from Richard Feynman, I wrote a book about, who said that a rainbow isn't any less beautiful because you understand how it's caused. It's much more beautiful when you understand the amazing things that are happening. In fact, it's much more exciting.
The truths of quantum mechanics are so strange that we will never intuit them, no matter how advanced we become as a civilization, because we are classical objects. We can't ever directly experience the phenomena, or at least rarely experience directly the phenomena that the mathematics of quantum mechanics tells us are true. Well, not only are both those strange, but it turns out general relativity and quantum mechanics are incompatible, mathematically. That when you try and apply the laws of quantum mechanics to the dynamics of space and time, you come up with nonsense, mathematical nonsense. In some sense, for most of our understanding of the universe, understanding quantum gravity is irrelevant. Right. It really is. We can understand almost all of nature without ever understanding quantum gravity. So while it's a fundamental theoretical question, it's not an obstacle to understanding the way much of the universe works, except for one thing that makes it interesting, more interesting, is that the universe is expanding. And what is very large now, at the very beginning, was very small. And if we really want to answer that important question, is how do we get here and why, or what caused the beginning of the universe? Was there something before the beginning? All those fascinating questions. At some point, we're stuck, because if we extrapolate back the universe, we know that the laws of physics hold back to the time our entire observable universe, all the 400 billion galaxies we see, was contained in regions smaller than the size of an atom. Right. But when you get smaller still, even that point we can understand it. But when you get smaller still, and really want to get to the very beginning, then we have to know how quantum mechanics and gravity work together, because gravity is what describes the universe on its largest scales, which at that time will be that big. Quantum mechanics describes on the smallest scales, which at that time will be that big. So at that point, it's the same scale. It's the same scale, and we really can never truly answer that fundamental question.
I think what you said is correct. You found a way to find an ethical theory that makes those two apparently inconsistent things consistent. Okay?
Yeah, right.
And I've had a lot of discussions on stage and off stage with various theologians whose job is to do just that, to find ways to resolve apparent inconsistencies, to find ethical solutions that validate their belief. But that is what's wrong, because the point of science and the reason it works is you don't just try and prove something you like to be true, you also try and prove it to be false. And that's what's really important. You don't just find a way to say the rainbows are caused by this or that. You actually try and see if your ideas are wrong and ask what's more plausible. And based on evidence and inquiry, what's more plausible. So what I find problematic is that the effort to find a rational excuse for something can work, but that doesn't make it right.
Yeah, we agree, because I think the worst gratuitously insulting people is to tell people that you're absolutely right because your God is right and theirs wrong. So I think you're absolutely right. No, you're not saying it. No, but I think you're absolutely right. The best way we'll come to be moral is by getting rid of all organized religions, which would claim that they have a monopoly on truth, and then we'll have a much better world. Absolutely.
Certainly, there are limits to science. As an empiricist, which is what I am, empirically, there are limits to what science can do. In fact, in my own field, cosmology, there are clearly limits because we have one universe to observe, and most of us live in that universe. The Republican Party in my country doesn't, so therefore, because of that, there may be many universes, and therefore there's obviously, in some real physical sense, a limited domain over which we can explore, and that's the key point. It's not just tools. Every academic discipline uses tools, and in some ways they're not that different. But the key part of what makes science and what makes it work is it's based on empirical evidence. Sort of rational thought applied to empirical evidence. And therefore, if you can't measure it, even in principle, I mean, there's lots of things we can't measure that we can talk about as a theoretical physicist. I think about things, a lot of things we can't measure right now. But if you can't ever measure it in principle, then science really has nothing to say about it. I would argue that anything else you tend to say about it is not worth much either. But it's certainly a fact that science generally can't address it if you can't measure it in principle. And that's of fundamental importance, I think, and we forget that. And so I think the difference that I would say is that the limits, I don't know what the ultimate limits to science are. There are limits now, and there are many areas where science has very little to say right now. But can I say that it will never have anything to say about it? Absolutely not. There's a huge difference between what's unknowable and what's not known. And so the only way you can find out if science has anything to say about it is try.
Right.
And if it has something useful to say, then make predictions which agree with experiments, then you can make progress. But you can try it, and it might not work. And an example, might be sort of sociology, where they tried to use the language of physics to apply to societies, and it was far too premature. They're much too complex. And consciousness, which is, as I was telling Dan, if I did physics because it's easy. If I want to do the hard stuff, I do consciousness.
Right. I get letters every day that I never got before, and those letters are from kids around the world, and also from people in small towns who tell me, and I'm just so happy I saw this, or I saw The Unbelievers, or I read your book, because I realized I'm not a bad person for asking these questions. I'm not evil. And that is, to me, something I really hadn't appreciated before, that religion has usurped this notion of morality, so that if you just saying, I don't buy it, automatically is equivalent to the saying, I'm not a good person. And that, to me, is the underlying most immoral aspect of religion. It tries to have a monopoly on morality and ethics. What it does is it makes people feel guilty for thinking for themselves, and I can attest to that from just the vast and every single day. I'm amazed at that, and I hadn't appreciated that as an evil before I actually started getting labeled and people wrote to me. So they did a further study, and they questioned people who claimed the Christian box. They said, do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in transubstantiation? Do you believe this? No. Why do you call yourself Christian? Because I like to think of myself as a good person. And I think most people call themselves Christians because they think if they don't, they'll be labeled as bad people.
The key thing that I think both Richard and I want to do is excite people about the wonders of reality, about the real universe and how amazing it is. and realize that they don't need this fake universe of myth and superstition. For me, that's what drives me. Is I think, and as an aside, I think people ultimately lose religion. But personally, I'm driven more by getting people excited about the real universe. And you might say, and I've had this discussion with at least one or two of the people who were in the beginning and end of the film, one in particular that I know of, whether, if people find solace in something, is it reasonable or justifiable to argue that what they're finding solace in is not right? Well, I don't think either Richard or I would go to someone's deathbed who's clinging on that and say, oh, forget it. But well, it depends who they are, actually. But the problem is that it's not innocuous. That beliefs, as I think I said in the film, that beliefs in things that aren't true inevitably produce actions which are often harmful. And so if it was just innocuous, I think I'd feel a lot less worried about it. But it's not innocuous, and therefore I think it's really important to try and convince people to base their actions on reality. And on the whole, while that may hurt some people, I think on the whole it leads to a better society.
The real philosophical and theological question is that makes it appear as if you need a divinity, that seems to violate the laws of physics, is how can you have all this stuff if there wasn't stuff in the first place? And the thing I wanted to celebrate was that you can get all this stuff from no stuff without any supernatural shenanigans, and that to me is amazing. And that's the question I wanted to address.
But you did not show how you get there from nothingness in the sense that philosophers have always meant the term. And that's why you started out rightly by saying,
I don't care what philosophers always mean the term. I defined what I meant by nothing.
Fine.
I defined my terms. They don't.
Didn't mean what they've always meant.
I don't define in terms of what they mean. I defined what I wrote a book. Right. Why is there something rather than nothing?
There is a sense of the word nothing as defined by you in which you have shown how something can arise for it. It's just not the sense that philosophers have always meant.
Fine.
Which is fine. Okay, so we agree on that.
Yeah,
And
I don't know what
say,
philosophers are. I would claim I've yet to meet a philosopher who's defined what they've always meant.
Well, they definitely...
No, when it comes to nothing, I define at least my terms. No one's ever countered me. You know what they define nothing as? That from which only God can create something.
No,
well, that's,
philosophers don't.
Not theologians. Now, the point, it amazes me when you say that so the central question of philosophy is a question which is unanswerable. Well, I come from a field where we actually try and ask questions we can answer. That's the difference between physics and philosophy. One makes progress, one doesn't.
And a good example of working in the other direction, you probably know the study, but there was a study done of prayer, the efficacy of prayer. And the study was interesting because there were people who were prayed for and people who weren't, and there were people who were told they were prayed for. And the people who were told they were prayed for did worse. Yes. And the idea is that they would put a lot of pressure on them to get better, and they didn't.
When Richard Dawkins says after the Paris attacks that women in headscarves should take them off in solidarity with the victims of the terrorist attack, is that fair? That seems like you're holding all Muslim women around the world responsible for a terrorist.
Trying to provoke people to think about what's the point of headscarves.
And
my point is, I think provoking every now and then is fine. In fact, I would say, and this offends Muslims, that the main point is that Islam isn't any more stupid than Christianity or Judaism. They're all ridiculous.
But do you think you can build alliances with people when you tell them they're stupid, they're foolish, they're silly, they believe in a creep as a god, etc., etc., etc.? Is that possible?
No, you can't build alliances. But there's some groups you'll never build alliances with, and I think
1.2 billion people.
No, but I'm not talking about those groups. I'm talking about Islamic fundamentalists, who, in fact, I argued, are in some sense more of a danger. The biggest threat of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is to Muslims.
I agree with you, which is why you probably shouldn't dismiss the entire faith and the entire community.
I don't think I have.
I think you've compared the God of Islam and Christianity to Saddam Hussein. That's not really a way of winning people over.
Well, I think all those gods are, no, but I think one has to, look, sometimes you have to get people to ask the question, what's the basis of their beliefs? Why are they doing it?
John Gray, the British philosopher, thinker, atheist, he says that a lot of people like you or Dawkins or others are campaigning atheists. They're missionaries. Would you accept that label, that you're a missionary for atheism?
I'm an evangelical for science. I'm pro understanding the real world and not letting myth and superstition build hatreds and separations between people. And that's my main interest. I'm much more interested in promoting science than I am destroying religion.
Lawrence Krauss.
Oh, well, that's ridiculous. In fact, it's ridiculous to the science that you do. When you do science, you're presuming that the results of an experiment in your laboratory apply in another laboratory.
the fundamental claim that if you just miracles in your particular religion, it's kind of remarkable that these violations of the laws of nature only occurred before video cameras and intelligence squared and the internet, and that you have these remarkable violations of the laws of nature in a book which I was really surprised to hear Dinesh call a scientific document, the Bible. I hope he really didn't mean that. St. Augustine would be very upset with you because he said the Bible wasn't scientific. But these violations of the laws of nature only occurred at a time when there was no evidence for them.
But Lawrence,
and you believe it.
Lawrence, but is there a logical argument that you can make against miracles? Not the I didn't see them and nobody has seen them lately argument, but is there a logical argument you can make against them?
Our logic is determined by nature, not by what we'd like. And nature has told us that miracles don't happen. That's it. It's not what I want or what I think should be rational. It's do they happen? And there's no evidence that they've ever happened.
Dinesh.
There's beauty in the paintings that Leonardo da Vinci and others and Michelangelo and others did in the context of religion, but that's just their response to the culture of the time. And I don't see why, given what you know now, you can't have that same wisdom without discarding the provincial basis of it, which was based, let's face it, on the imaginings of illiterate peasants, Bronze Age peasants, before we knew the Earth even orbited the sun.
Mm-hmm. So, and I think Einstein actually analyzed it that way too, and the primitive origins of religion, although he did not believe in a personal God, and his statement about God, statement about God playing dice had nothing to do with God, and Niels Bohr came back and said, who is Einstein to tell God what to do? But he did, at the end of his life, become very appreciative of Judaism. He said, Judaism is about life as we live it and can know it. That aspect of religion. But okay.
Yeah, no, and so if you accept it as a philosophy, it's fine up to a point, although actually, I have grave problems with it as a philosophy as well. But, there's wisdom in all the writings that humans have come up with at some level, and we should appreciate that wisdom. And I don't mean to suggest we shouldn't open our minds to trying to see those reflections and the potential wisdom, but I guess, as Einstein would have said, I don't see the underpinnings. And he would have, as a cultural thing, he would have said, well, it's important to preserve that culture. And I guess I believe strongly in preserving culture, but culture that's based on productive reality. I personally think that every single thing that religion provides, rationality, empiricism, and science can provide, and not only that, it can provide it better.
Can a scientist believe in God and still be a functioning scientist?
Absolutely. There are functioning scientists and who can believe in God. There are functioning scientists who are pedophiles. There are functioning scientists who are... No, I'm serious. I mean, the point is, scientists are human.
Well, but that was a very, very, very rough grouping that you just did.
Well, in the Catholic Church, it's not so different, but
I don't know. I don't know, in the spirit of this thing, if you want to step back from that.
Okay, but what I want to point out is that people are not fully rational. The point is that
the question is, can you be a good scientist and believe in God?
As long as you don't take the God into the laboratory. As a very famous biologist said, when I go into the laboratory, I become an atheist, because when I twiddle the knobs in my experiment, I don't believe there's some angel affecting the results of the experiment. And if I believe that in the laboratory, why should I believe it outside? Some people choose to believe it outside. The minute they take it into the laboratory, they stop being good scientists. We don't have absolute truths in science, unlike religion. That's the reason that science makes progress, because we can change our minds. And I think that's a really important thing, that we, as I often say, if you're a theoretical physicist, the two most important states to be in are either wrong or confused. Because that means there's a lot left to learn. It's hard to imagine. I mean, given that there are over 100 billion stars in our galaxy, we now have learned that most of those stars have planets around them, so solar systems. 100 billion galaxies, with all those stars and galaxies, and we also know that there's lots of water out there, organic molecules, and sunlight, which is all that was necessary for life to evolve here on Earth. So it's hard to imagine it hasn't evolved somewhere else. I find it amazing that here we are in this random planet, in this random place in the middle of nowhere, and we have, through our minds and the fact that we're graced with consciousness,
been able to understand the universe to the earliest moments of the Big Bang. I think it's worth celebrating. These are ideas that are fascinating. Part of the benefit of science, we always talk about technology, and of course science is responsible for everything in this room almost. But for me, science is as important for its ideas and its impact on our culture. It's like great art and literature and music. It's what makes being humans worth being human.
But then when you step up here, you act as if science has demonstrated that the universe did in fact come from nothing, whereas you say it never did. You have not made that demonstration, and you admit it.
When I was up there, I said it was plausible. And plausible is remarkable because everything that's you've talked about in terms of religion is implausible. So the point is that just like with evolution, a simple plausible assumption appears to work is remarkable, and we're celebrating. And so the reason I say could and might is because I'm honest. And also because I haven't presumed the answer before I ask the question. The question is religion important? Because that's an obvious thing. Religion is obviously important. So are nuclear weapons. The question is religion outmoded, and are nuclear weapons outmoded? And will the world be a better place without them? And the answer, both those, is yes. Okay, religion is very important, nuclear weapons are very important, but neither of them in the modern world serve a productive purpose. And so I think that I accept and don't need to debate the question of whether religion is an important part of the way the world is run. The question is, should it be, should it continue to be, and is it decreasing? And in fact, what also hasn't been pointed out is that in most places, in fact happily, monotonically in the first world, the people identifying themselves as religious is decreasing year by year. The first year in England, by the way, as you know from a recent poll, more than half the population finally acknowledged that they didn't have any religious affiliation. In the United States even, it's been decreasing in spite of the efficiency of competitions.
Science refutes God is our motion, and here to summarize his position in support of this motion, Lawrence Krauss. He is a theoretical physicist and director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University.
Human beings were clearly programmed by evolution to impute intentionality to the world around them. Meaning and purpose was infused in all everyday events to make sense of a dangerous, difficult, and uncaring world. So we had rituals behind the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans, in all societies. The rise of our physical understanding has slowly caused us to do away with those many gods. We no longer have Mars, the god of war, Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, Thor, the god of storms. As Michael has said, everyone here, or maybe everyone, is now an atheist with respect to those gods. And there's a reason for that. Science has taught us that instead of capricious beings, there's an order to nature. And that order does not appear to involve a divinity. There's no need for a divinity. Laws of nature describable by mathematics make predictions that allow us to not only predict the future, but control it without the need for any supernatural shenanigans. And in fact, it amazes me that asking the question, is God necessary, is somehow an evil thing. When we stop asking questions, that will be an evil thing. Science has taught us also that we want to believe, in the words of Fox Mulder. And we should be skeptical of those desires. As the physicist Richard Feynman told us, the easiest people to fool are ourselves. As scientists, we have to train ourselves to be skeptical of wanting to believe. And we should try and overcome our natural tendency to assume special significance to events. And human beings are also inevitably programmed to ask why, as we've heard it. But the why question is ill-posed, because it presumes purpose. It presumes the answer to the question before you ask the question. What if there is no purpose? Does there need to be purpose? And science tells us there's no evidence of purpose. So the why question is ill-posed. Our opponents want to keep the clock from ticking by avoiding the evidence of reality. And therefore, science, by telling us there's no need for purpose, has refuted the need for God, and that's why you should support our position.
Thank you, Lawrence Krauss. And that concludes our closing statements.
Not being a person of faith, I didn't have to start my discussion by whatever Arabic sentence you had to start yours with. I'm free to start it with however I want, which is I find liberating. Now, let me first say, I want to thank you very much for the kind graciousness with which you invited me, and I'm very hesitant to say some of the things I'm going to say, because I learned to be polite to your hosts. But I think it's polite in some sense to try and point out nonsense when nonsense is there, even if even if it's offensive. So I'm sorry that I'm sure I will offend some people in this audience. I generally offend people in every audience, so you should feel not particularly special.
It's a beautiful picture from the Hubble Space Telescope of a distant galaxy, far, far away and long, long ago. And there's a whole galaxy, it's about 1 billion light years away. We're looking at it as it looked 1 billion years ago. So many of those stars no longer exist. And here's an object that's just as bright as the whole center of the galaxy. You'd think it's a star that's near in our galaxy that just got caught in the picture frame. It's not. It's a star on the edge of that galaxy that has exploded. And exploding stars shine with a brightness of 10 billion stars. They're the brightest fireworks in the universe, supernovae. And they're remarkable, and I keep having asides. Maybe I'll get to my point eventually. But this is something that I wrote a whole book about, and someone asked me yesterday why I wrote that book. Because it is the most poetic thing I know about the universe. Richard wrote a great book called, what's it called? Our Ancestors? What's it called? Ancestor's Tale, yes. I wanted to make sure I got that right. And I wrote a book that was a different ancestor's tale. It was called Adam. But the amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They're created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway, as far as the question of whether you question your own beliefs, of course you do. Because in fact, I imagine you came to your belief in Islam through a series of analysis. I doubt you were born with it, in spite of the fact that we labeled children of Muslims as Muslim, and we labeled children of Christians as Christian. In spite of that, we don't ever call them neoliberals or libertarians or conservatives. Here's a 2-year-old conservative. But we're perfectly happy to say, here's a 2-year-old Catholic child. What an awful thing to do to a child. It's child abuse.
Okay, so it's all in. I have been given the results. Remember, the team that changes the most minds is declared the victor, and here it is. Before the debate, 37% agreed with the motion, 34% were against, and 29% were undecided. So those are the first results. Remember, the team that has the highest percentage change is declared the winner. In the second vote, let's go first to the team that was arguing for the motion. Their number went from 37% to 50%. That's a 13% increase. So the team arguing against the motion has to do better than 13%. Let's see how they did. Before the vote, 34%. The second vote, 38%. That's up 4%. It's not enough. The team arguing for the motion, Science Refutes God, has won the debate. Our congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time.
The key thing of science is we don't claim to know everything. In fact, the point of religion is you claim to know the truth before you know anything. And in science, I make a big distinction between what we know, namely measurable facts, and what might be true, because I believe in being honest. And in fact, as a scientist, one of the most wonderful things about being a scientist, as I've often say, the best state to be in is be either wrong or confused, because it means there's more to learn. So I am happily aware that I don't understand everything. It's evident to me on a daily basis. And therefore, I make a very important point when I write to make a difference between what's been subject to experiment and what is plausible. Now, the fact that something's plausible, I try and explain why it's plausible. The particles in empty space that I talk about from the Einstein uncertainty principle are not plausible, they're facts. They produce the best measured predictions in nature that allow us to do spectroscopy, measure, look for cancer, everything else. So those are not speculative. However, we don't have a theory of quantum gravity, and I was upfront about that. I hope one of the things I work on is to try and understand a theory of quantum gravity. But But I think it is a hallmark of the one beauty of science that we don't claim to know everything, but it is fascinating that we can ask what's plausible. Now, you say that this leads to an incredibly implausible possibility that space may have been created from nothing. Now, why that is implausible to you, I find amazing. Moreover, why it's more implausible to you than the claim that the universe is so complex that it required a being that was even more complex. But I won't ask where that being created, how that complex being was created, because I can't answer that question, so I'm going to make him eternal. Then I'm going to say that that complex being, which is more complex than the universe that I can't understand, created a universe, waited 4.5 billion years, waited 250,000 years for hominids to become reasonable, found an illiterate peasant before video recorders or anything else, and revealed the truth to him. Why you find that more plausible is remarkable to me.
I support the federal government's chaplaincy program. I think it provides